A little girl stands on a quiet beach in northern England. The photograph looks ordinary at first, but behind her, a strange white figure appears in the background. The image became known as the Solway Firth spaceman, and even experts struggled to explain who or what was standing there. In another photograph taken in Dallas in 1963, crowds run in panic after the assassination of President Kennedy. Among them stands a woman wearing a headscarf. She appears to be calmly filming the event. Investigators searched for her for years. She became known as the Babushka Lady, but her identity was never confirmed. Then there is a family photograph taken inside a Texas home. 4 people sit at a table, smiling at the camera. Yet above them, hanging in the air, a dark human shape seems to be falling from the ceiling. And in a photograph from 1940, taken during the reopening of a bridge in Canada, one man stands out from the crowd. His sunglasses, clothing, and camera look strangely modern. Why do some photographs refuse to fit the historical record? Sometimes a single image can raise more questions than thousands of documents. Historians have examined these photographs for decades, and some of them still do not have a clear explanation. For more than a century, photographs have been treated as one of the most reliable witnesses of history. Unlike paintings or drawings, a photograph appears to capture a real moment exactly as it happened. A camera does not interpret events in the same way an artist might. It records light, movement, and detail. Because of this, historians have often relied on photographs as direct visual evidence of the past. The historical record shows that photography quickly became an essential tool for documenting the world. Wars were photographed. Cities were photographed. Families, ceremonies, and everyday life were preserved on film. These images allow us to look directly into another time. They give the impression that we are seeing history exactly as it unfolded. But photographs are not always as simple as they seem. A camera can capture far more than the photographer intended. In a single frame, small details can appear that no one noticed when the shutter was pressed. A shadow may look like a human figure. A reflection might create the illusion of something standing in the background. Sometimes a person appears in the frame who cannot be identified later. And occasionally, the photograph seems to show something that simply does not make sense. This is where things begin to get interesting. Historians and researchers have encountered images that contain strange figures, unusual objects, or people who were never identified. In many cases, these photographs have been studied carefully for years, even decades. Experts analyze lighting, film grain, and the surrounding historical record in an attempt to understand what truly happened in that moment. Sometimes the mystery is eventually solved, but sometimes it is not. Even after careful analysis, a small number of photographs continue to raise questions that remain unanswered, and that raises an interesting question. Today we are going to examine several photographs that continue to puzzle historians and researchers. When historians encounter a strange photograph, the first step is usually not speculation, it is analysis. Over the past century, researchers have developed a number of ways to explain unusual images, and in many cases the mystery turns out to be far less dramatic than it first appears. One of the most common explanations involves simple photographic artifacts. Early cameras and film were far from perfect. Glass plates and early film stock were sensitive to light and easily damaged. Sometimes a photograph could accidentally record 2 separate exposures on the same plate. When this happened, the result could be a faint extra figure, a duplicate shape, or a ghost-like silhouette appearing somewhere in the image. To a modern viewer, it might look mysterious, but to a photography expert, it may simply be a technical accident. Film defects can also create strange effects. Dust particles, scratches, and chemical imperfections sometimes appear as unusual spots or shapes. Light entering the lens at the wrong angle can create bright streaks or reflections across the photograph. These small flaws can transform an otherwise ordinary image into something that looks unexpected. Another explanation has less to do with cameras and more to do with the way the human mind works. Our brains are extremely good at finding patterns. We naturally search for familiar shapes, especially faces and human figures. This tendency is known as pareidolia. It is the same reason people sometimes see faces in clouds, shadows, or rock formations. When looking at an old photograph, a random shadow or reflection may appear to resemble a person standing in the background, but in reality, it may simply be an illusion created by the way our brains interpret visual information. There is also another problem that historians often face when studying old photographs. Over time, important details about an image can disappear. The photographer may be unknown. The exact location may not have been recorded. Sometimes even the date is uncertain. As photographs pass through generations, the story behind them can slowly fade away. The historical record shows that many images survive long after the circumstances around them are forgotten. When that happens, a simple photograph can begin to look far more mysterious than it originally was. And yet, even after considering technical errors, visual illusions, and lost historical information, some photographs still seem to resist easy explanations. In 1964, a firefighter named Jim Templeton took a simple photograph of his young daughter while visiting the Solway Firth in northern England. The image looked completely ordinary at first. A little girl stands on a quiet beach, smiling at the camera. Behind her is nothing but open sky and the distant shoreline. But when the photograph was developed, Templeton noticed something unusual. Standing behind the girl appeared to be a tall, white figure. The shape looked strangely human. Even more strangely, it seemed to resemble a person wearing what looked like a helmet and a suit. The image quickly attracted attention. Some people suggested it might show an astronaut-like figure in the background. Others assumed it must be a simple photographic error. The photograph was eventually examined by experts, including specialists from NASA, who were interested in unusual imagery. According to the analysis that was made public, there was no clear evidence of a double exposure or manipulation. Some historians suggest that the figure may simply be another person standing farther away, partially overexposed by the bright light of the sky. But the exact identity of the figure was never confirmed. Another photograph raises a very different kind of mystery. On November 22, 1963, during the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, many witnesses captured images of the chaotic scene. Among the people present that day was a woman wearing a headscarf. In several photographs and film frames, she appears standing calmly near the street while holding a camera. Investigators later referred to her as the babushka lady because of the scarf she wore. What makes her appearance unusual is that she seemed to be filming the event from a clear vantage point. If her camera recorded what happened, it could have captured extremely important evidence. But despite years of investigation, her identity was never definitively confirmed, and the photographs or film she may have taken have never been publicly found. A third image comes from a family photograph said to have been taken inside a house in Texas during the 1950s. The picture shows several family members sitting together at a dining table, posing for the camera in a relaxed moment. Yet when viewers look at the upper part of the photograph, something appears that seems difficult to explain. Hanging above the table is a dark shape that resembles a human body falling from the ceiling. Some researchers believe the image may have been altered or staged long after it was taken. Others suggest it could be the result of photographic damage or manipulation. The original source of the photograph remains uncertain, and its history is still debated. Each of these images appears simple at first glance. A family snapshot, a crowd in the street, a child playing on a beach. But the more closely historians examine them, the more complicated the story becomes. To understand why certain photographs become mysterious, it helps to look at the period when photography first became widely available. In the early days, taking a photograph was a slow and complicated process. Large cameras, glass plates, and long exposure times meant that only trained photographers could capture images. But this began to change near the end of the 19th century. When companies like Kodak introduced smaller and more affordable cameras, photography suddenly became accessible to ordinary people. One of the most famous marketing slogans of the time promised simplicity. You press the button, we do the rest. With this new technology, photography moved out of professional studios and into everyday life. Families began documenting birthdays, vacations, and simple moments at home. Travelers carried cameras with them. Soldiers brought cameras to the front lines. Political events were photographed by both journalists and bystanders. For the first time in history, millions of ordinary people were creating visual records of the world around them. The historical record shows that this transformation had a profound effect. Photography became part of how history itself was documented. Images captured battles, public speeches, protests, and celebrations. Entire archives of family photographs were created, preserving everyday life in a way that written records never could. But the rapid spread of photography also created a new problem. Many of these photographs were taken quickly and casually. A person might take a picture and place it in an album without writing down when or where it was taken. Over time, those albums were passed down through families, labels were lost, names were forgotten, the identity of the photographer disappeared. Some historians suggest that millions of photographs from the 20th century now exist without clear documentation. There may be no caption, no date, and no explanation of what the image actually shows. The photograph survives, but the story behind it slowly fades away. This creates a strange situation for researchers. A single image can remain perfectly preserved for decades, sometimes even a century. Yet the circumstances surrounding the moment it captured may vanish completely. When that happens, historians are left with an image that feels incomplete. The photograph shows a moment in time, but without the missing details, that moment can become difficult to interpret. And sometimes, when the background story disappears entirely, an ordinary photograph can begin to look like a mystery. When historians encounter a photograph that seems unusual, the process that follows often resembles a careful investigation. Researchers do not immediately assume that an image shows something extraordinary. Instead, they begin by asking a simple question: what exactly are we looking at? One of the first steps involves the technical study of the photograph itself. Specialists in photographic analysis examine the physical details of the image. They study the grain of the film, the direction of the light, and the behavior of shadows within the frame. Even small details can reveal important clues. The way light falls across a surface may indicate the position of the sun or the presence of another object outside the frame. Film grain can sometimes reveal whether parts of an image were altered or combined. The material of the photograph is also important. Early photographs were often produced on glass plates or fragile film. By examining scratches, chemical marks, or signs of aging, experts can sometimes determine whether the image has been changed after it was originally taken. These techniques, sometimes referred to as photographic forensics, allow researchers to separate genuine photographic effects from later manipulation. But studying the photograph itself is only part of the process. Researchers also try to reconstruct the moment when the image was captured. This often involves searching for the location where the photograph was taken. Buildings, landscapes, and street layouts can sometimes be compared with historical maps or modern photographs of the same place. If the location can be identified, it may help narrow down the time period or the event that appears in the image. Witness accounts can also be important. Some historians search newspaper archives, police reports, or personal letters to see whether anyone described the event that appears in the photograph. Even a short written reference can help place an image within a larger historical story. Modern technology has added another layer to these investigations. Digital tools allow researchers to scan old photographs at very high resolution. Once the image is enlarged, details that were once invisible may become clearer. Faces in the background can sometimes be identified. Objects that once looked like shadows may turn out to be something entirely different. Yet even with all these tools, there is often a limit to what can be discovered. Many mysterious photographs come from moments where no written records survive. The photograph itself may be the only piece of evidence that the event ever happened. When that occurs, investigators must work with a single frozen moment in time, trying to understand a story that may have disappeared long ago. When researchers begin to compare unusual photographs from different periods, an interesting pattern slowly starts to appear. At first glance, each image may seem completely unique. The circumstances are different, the locations are different, and the people involved often have no connection to one another. Yet when these photographs are studied together, certain similarities begin to emerge. Many historians suggest that a large number of mysterious photographs can actually be grouped into a few recurring types. These categories do not explain every detail, but they help researchers understand why certain images continue to raise questions. One of the most common patterns involves unidentified figures. In many historical photographs, a person appears in the background whose identity cannot be confirmed. Sometimes the figure is standing quietly among a crowd. In other cases, the person seems to be observing an event from a distance. The woman known as the babushka lady is a well-known example of this kind of mystery. She appears clearly in several photographs taken during the assassination of President Kennedy, yet her identity has never been fully established. Similar situations appear in wartime photographs, where soldiers or civilians can be seen in the background but are never mentioned in any written record. Another pattern involves objects that seem out of place. Occasionally, a photograph captures something that appears unusual for its time or location. The Solway Firth photograph is often discussed in this category. A simple picture of a child on a beach unexpectedly contains a distant figure that resembles a person wearing unusual clothing. Some historians suggest that the figure may simply be another person standing far away, partially overexposed by bright light. But the unusual shape has continued to attract attention because it appears so different from the surrounding scene. There is also a third type of mystery that appears again and again in historical images. Sometimes the strange detail is not the main subject of the photograph at all. Instead, it hides quietly in the background. A shadow, a figure, or an unusual shape may only become visible when the photograph is examined closely. The Cooper family photograph is often discussed as an example of this phenomenon, where a disturbing shape appears above the family table. What makes these cases particularly intriguing is how small the unusual detail often is. In many images, the mystery occupies only a tiny portion of the frame, a single figure, a distant silhouette, a shape that almost blends into the background. And yet, that one detail can transform an ordinary photograph into a question that historians continue to study decades later. When researchers begin exploring unusual photographs, they often discover that the number of strange images is far greater than expected. At first, a few famous examples may seem like isolated mysteries. But as historians search through archives and old collections, similar cases begin to appear again and again. One photograph that has attracted attention for many years was taken in 1940 during the reopening of a bridge in British Columbia, Canada. The image shows a large crowd gathered to celebrate the event. Men wear coats and hats typical of the period, and the scene appears to match the time perfectly. But among the crowd stands one man who seems strangely different. He appears to be wearing dark sunglasses that look unusually modern. His clothing appears slightly out of place compared to the surrounding crowd. In his hands, he holds a camera that some observers believe resembles models that became common decades later. Because of these details, the photograph became widely known as the time traveler image. Some historians suggest that the clothing may simply represent rare styles that existed at the time. Others believe the camera and glasses may not be as modern as they appear. Even so, the photograph continues to spark curiosity because the figure stands out so clearly from everyone around him. Another group of photographs comes from a remote valley in Norway known as Hessdalen. Since the late 20th century, unusual lights have occasionally been observed moving across the sky in this region. Some of these lights have been photographed by both researchers and visitors. In the images, bright glowing shapes appear floating above the landscape. Scientists have proposed several possible explanations, including atmospheric plasma or unusual electrical activity. Yet the exact cause of the lights has never been fully confirmed, and the photographs continue to attract attention from researchers. Even earlier examples come from the 19th century, during the early years of photography. At that time, a movement known as spiritualism became popular in parts of Europe and North America. Some photographers claimed they could capture images of spirits or ghosts appearing beside living people. These so-called spirit photographs often showed faint figures standing behind families or sitting quietly in empty chairs. Later investigations revealed that many of these images were created using double exposure techniques. Yet the popularity of these photographs shows how easily mysterious images could influence public imagination. When all of these examples are placed side by side, a broader picture begins to emerge. Across different countries and different decades, photography has repeatedly captured images that appear unusual or difficult to explain. Some eventually receive clear explanations. Others remain open to interpretation, and together they reveal something surprising. The history of photography is filled with images that seem to exist just slightly beyond our understanding. When historians encounter unusual photographs, the first step is rarely to assume that something impossible has taken place. Instead, researchers usually begin by asking a simpler question: what part of the story might be missing? In many cases, the most likely explanation is that the photograph has simply lost its original background. Over time, images often become separated from the information that once explained them. A picture may survive for decades while the details around it slowly disappear. The name of the photographer is forgotten. The location is no longer known. The exact date may never have been recorded. When this happens, a perfectly ordinary moment can begin to look mysterious simply because we no longer understand the situation in which it was captured. Another common explanation involves the technical limitations of early photography. Cameras from the 19th and early 20th centuries worked very differently from modern devices. Long exposure times were often required, which meant that movement could blur or distort parts of an image. Light could reflect unexpectedly inside the lens, creating shapes or bright forms that were not visible to the photographer at the time. Dust on the glass plates or imperfections in the film could also produce unusual marks. Some historians suggest that these technical effects account for many photographs that appear strange at first glance. What looks like a mysterious object might simply be a reflection. What seems to be a hidden figure might actually be a shadow captured during a long exposure. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Human perception is naturally drawn to patterns. Our brains are very good at finding familiar shapes, especially faces or human figures, even when those shapes appear only by chance. This tendency can lead people to see meaning in details that were never intended to represent anything at all, and sometimes the explanation may be even simpler. A rare coincidence can occur at the exact moment a photograph is taken. A person walks into the frame unexpectedly. A shadow falls in just the right place. A reflection appears at the precise angle needed to create a confusing image. Yet even after considering all of these possibilities, some photographs continue to resist clear explanation. They remain open questions in the historical record, reminding us that even familiar technology can occasionally capture something that still leaves researchers searching for answers. A photograph captures only a fraction of a second. One small moment, preserved on paper or glass, frozen in time. At first glance, it often seems simple. A family standing together, a crowd gathered in a city square, a quiet landscape somewhere far from the center of history. For a long time, photographs were considered one of the most reliable records of the past. Unlike paintings or drawings, they appeared to show the world exactly as it was. A camera does not imagine. It records light. And because of this, people came to trust photographs as direct evidence of what once happened. But when historians begin to examine these images more closely, something interesting begins to appear. A photograph may contain far more than the person behind the camera ever intended to capture. In the corner of the frame, there may be a figure no one noticed at the time. In the background, there may be an object whose meaning is unclear. Sometimes there is a person whose identity was never recorded, someone who appears in the image and then disappears from history entirely. Over the years, researchers studying historical archives have discovered many images like this. At first they appear ordinary, yet the longer they are examined, the more questions they seem to raise. A detail that once seemed insignificant begins to attract attention. A shadow looks unusual. A face appears where none was expected. Some of these mysteries eventually receive explanations. Others remain uncertain, even after decades of study. The photograph itself survives, but the story around it fades. This creates a strange situation in the historical record. A moment is preserved forever, yet the meaning of that moment slowly disappears. And this leads to a final thought. If a single photograph can capture a moment that historians continue to question many years later, then perhaps the past still contains many details we have not fully understood. because every photograph shows us only one small fragment of history, and sometimes that fragment raises questions that remain unanswered for generations. If a single photograph can raise questions that remain unanswered for decades, what else might still be hidden inside the historical record?